Hi there and welcome back to another NJS instructional video. Today we are low on smoking a beautiful brisket on our Kamado and we're roughly 1 hour into the cook. So let's go back to yesterday in the kitchen preparing our brisket for today's cook. Now for our brisket's dry rub, we'll be doing a mix of the Killer Hogs TX brisket rub together with a bit of Lane's Magic Dust and a bit of sumac. So 3 heaped tablespoons of the Killer Hogs TX brisket rub. Now this TX brisket rub is more than sufficient for a brisket, so it's a good mix of salt and pepper, as well as some other ingredients. So now we'll add 1 tablespoon of Lane's Magic Dust. And finally we'll add 1 teaspoon of sumac, which will give the brisket a nice colour, as well as a little bit of extra flavour. So that's our rub, and we're just going to mix that all together. So now that it's all mixed in, it'll give it a nice consistency as we put it over our brisket. So here is our brisket taken straight out of the packets, and I've just run it under cold water and given it a pat dry. And you'll see that in some areas the brisket is separating there, and that's fine. And there is quite a fair bit of fat through the middle there, but we will leave that bit of fat in and hopefully that'll render down. So we'll just give this a very light trim and just take off a little bit of the fatty areas underneath a little bit of that silvery skin, and then we'll be ready to put a binder on the brisket and rub it. Now, if you're not too sure regarding trimming, sometimes it's better to leave a little bit more of the fat on, especially if it's a leaner piece of brisket, and that way it retains that juiciness and moisture as that fat renders down during the cook. So we've given our brisket a light trim, and I have kept a fair bit of the fat around it, and it's more of that softer fat which will render down really nice. And that fat layer in between the meat there will also render down during the cook and give us a really nice juicy brisket. Now before we apply our dry rub, I'm going to put some binder on the brisket to help that dry rub bind to the surface of the meat. You can use water, you can use olive oil. Today I'm going to be using some Australian mustard, some yellow mustard, and just apply a very thin coat underneath and across the top, and then we'll apply our dry rub. So approximately 1 tablespoon is more than sufficient for this brisket. And just with your hand, apply that all over. Now the binder doesn't usually add too much, if any, flavour to the brisket, so don't be afraid to use mustard. It won't impact on the flavour greatly. So now that we've rubbed it down, we're going to flip it over and start on the underside, apply our dry rub all over, and then do the same on the top. Now we're going to apply a light to medium coat all around our brisket with our dry rub. There's no need to go too overboard and overpowering. We do want to taste the meat as well. And to tackle the sides, we do that. I'm just going to apply my hand on the side like that, not touching the brisket, and just so the rub can fall on the sides and catch there as well. What will happen with our brisket, because we have this loose piece like that, as the meat starts cooking and contracting, that will probably lift and underneath will be revealed. So we'll put a bit of dry rub underneath as well, so we do get some flavour around that side of the meat as well. Now, because we'll be doing an overnight dry brine as such, or a dry seasoning, I've got here a bread rack prepared and a tray. So I'll place our brisket on top of this, and the idea is we'll put this in the fridge overnight, and by placing it on a bread rack like this, It allows any juice, if any, to go and drip down into the tray and not impact on the coating of our rub. What can happen if you do place the brisket on a tray directly, the juices that do come out of the brisket overnight can impact on the rub and actually wash it away. So we don't want that. And by doing this, it'll help us form a bit of a crust on the surface of the brisket. And it also allows the salt to work its way deep into the meat and really extract a lot of flavor in our brisket. So now that's ready to place in the fridge. So now that our brisket is in the fridge, we'll allow that to sit overnight, ready to put first thing in the morning on our Kamado. So let's prepare our Kamado for our brisket cook, and you'll observe that there is a bit of charcoal left over from a previous cook which we can use. I will clean a little bit of that up, and then we'll get into our smoking wood that we're going to use for this cook, and then the charcoal. Now for our cook, we'll be using 2 pieces of oak as our smoking timber, and we'll bury those deep down inside of the Kamado. And all around of our smoking wood, we'll place charcoal and on top of it as well, because it's going to take 45 minutes to 60 minutes for us to get heat soak into the Kamado and our desired cooking temperature of around 120 degrees Celsius or 250 degrees Fahrenheit. The idea then is to prevent the wood from igniting roughly until that 1 hour mark, at which point we're almost ready to put our brisket on once we have a nice clean blue smoke. Now you'll observe that we filled up our Kamado approximately 1/3 of the way with charcoal, as opposed to about half or 3/4 full. Now there's 2 reasons behind this. Number one, with the amount of charcoal we have, that's more than sufficient for a 10 or 12 hour cook at a low and slow temperature. Secondly, by having less charcoal, we have better airflow and we can run our fire hotter because there's less fuel. And by running the fire hotter, we can have a cleaner burn and a cleaner smoke penetrating through to our meat. Now we'll place our firelighters in almost a circular shape around the charcoal so we can have the top burn and then that slowly penetrate down to the bottom and eventually into our smoking wood. Now it's really important, because we'll be starting the fire inside the Kamado, that we use a natural or chemical free means of starting the fire. So I'll be using 5 natural firelighters which will be positioned above the charcoal, and we'll use a match to light those up. That'll allow the charcoal on top to catch and then eventually seep down and start burning our smoking wood. Now a chemical or a petrol or gasoline based firelighter will actually emit chemicals, and that'll soak up in the ceramic of our Kamado, and that'll also penetrate into the food, and it can take up to 4 cycles for that chemical to actually burn out of the ceramic. So it's really important they use a natural or chemical free means of starting the fire. Now with our firelighters, there's no need to bury them deep under charcoal. How we've set them up with a few pieces either side is enough for the charcoal to catch all around, and we'll get a nice glow on the top, which will then eventually penetrate down into our smoking wood. And I'm also going to place some smoking chips in our ashtray, and as the hot ash and coal starts falling in, these will ignite and give us some nice smoke, which will help sustain it throughout the cook. Now for our water pan, which will also double up as our drip pan, I'm going to use a stainless steel pizza base and just put a bit of foil over the top, and that'll make it really easy to clean afterwards. So now our Kamado is all set for us to start up the fire early in the morning and get that brisket on. Now let's go through the plan of attack for today's brisket cook. So we started the fire just after 6 AM in the morning, and our brisket has gone on at 7:30 AM this morning. Now for the first 2 hours, we're not even going to open up the dome and just let the brisket smoke in the Kamado at around 120 degrees Celsius. At the 2 hour mark, we'll spritz our brisket with apple cider vinegar and that'll help keep the brisket nice and moist and help that smoke penetrate down into the flesh. And for every hour after that, up until around the 4-hour mark, we'll spritz the brisket. Since our brisket is fairly small, weighing in at just under 4 pounds, we anticipate this cook will take around 7 hours on the Kamado with the 2-hour rest. We also anticipate that at the 3 to 4 hour mark, we'll reach thermal stall inside our brisket. Now we do want to wrap the brisket just as it comes out of that thermal stall. So that'll be roughly at the 4 to 5 hour mark. Wrapping the brisket will help it retain its moisture and will also help it push through that thermal stall. At the 7-hour mark, we anticipate that the brisket will be anywhere from 91 degrees Celsius right through to 99 degrees Celsius, or 195 degrees Fahrenheit and 210 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, an ideal internal temperature of our brisket is that 95 degrees Celsius mark, or around that 203 degrees Fahrenheit mark. However, it's important that we cook not to the internal temperature, but to the tenderness of the meat. So once we reach that 7-hour mark, we'll also be prodding our brisket and just checking for tenderness as well. And if we're happy with that tenderness, we'll then pull the brisket off and allow it to rest for around 2 hours. Now, the aim with the brisket is to not have it underdone and chewy. We want it ideal, so when we slice it, it doesn't fall apart, but it's also very soft. It passes our jiggle tests and also breaks away easily without crumbling under its own weight. Now, as our charcoal is lighting up, we'll open up the bottom vent fully, as well as the top vent fully of the Kamado. We'll also put in our X-rack, we'll put in our heat deflector plates, but push them to the side to allow the flames to come up and to get good airflow throughout the Kamado. And then we'll eventually put our grill and close our Kamado. Now, it'll take anywhere from 45 minutes to 1 hour for our Kamado to get up to temperature. Now, during this warm-up period, we do want to get good heat soak in our Kamado. As such, we'll have to adjust our top and bottom vent settings so we don't overshoot our target cooking temperature, which stays around the 120 degrees Celsius or 250 degree Fahrenheit mark. It's a lot easier to bring up our Kamado slowly to temperature rather than overshoot that temperature and try and bring the temperature back down. Now, once our charcoal catches and starts glowing, we'll close up those heat deflector plates also and just allow the Kamado to get to temperature. Something else to be mindful of is our temperature gauge will increase during this initial startup where we've got direct contact between the flame and potentially the temperature gauge. Now, that's not to be worried. What we are looking for is a good heat soak in the Kamado's ceramic, so the top dome and also the bottom dome. And we're aiming for a target temperature of 120 degrees. And once we put our heat deflector plates back together so we don't have a direct path for that flame anymore, you'll notice that our temperature gauge will stop. So something to be mindful of when you are cooking in a Kamado, don't worry about that initial temperature spike. What we're looking for is a good heat soak and a constant stable temperature for our cooking. In fact, you'll also see right now that our temperature has just dropped as those flames go down and the coal starts igniting. So now it's been about 15 minutes, we're just going to put our heat deflector plates back together. Now, when putting the heat deflector plates back together and in their final position, just make sure you have a nice even consistency of gap all the way around. Now, while our Kamado is heating up, we are getting a bit of white smoke coming out, which is fine. For our cook, we are after that blue, almost clear smoke to penetrate through to our brisket, and that is a nice sweet smelling and sweet tasting smoke that we're after. Now, once our temperature gauge reaches around the 80 degrees Celsius mark, or around the 200 degree Fahrenheit, we will start reducing the top and bottom vent settings so we can slowly bring up our cooking temperature to around the 120 degree mark. Now, we're very close to getting our ideal heat soak and temperature in the Kamado. Now, just a quick note on the water tray. So this will double up as both a water tray and a drip pan. Now the idea behind a water pan or a water tray in a smoker or in a Kamado like this is to keep the environment inside the cooker nice and moist or nice and humid, and that'll help the smoke penetrate into the meat. So now we're at our ideal cooking temperature of 120 degrees Celsius, and we have good heat soak in our Kamado, and we also have a nice clean smoke happening. So I have closed the top vent daisy wheel all the way, but left the smaller holes fully open. And for our bottom vents, I'm just going to reduce that even further, so just under a finger width wide. Here is our brisket that we've allowed to dry rub overnight in the refrigerator, and I'll place it on the Kamado shortly. Now what I like to do is place a cold brisket onto the Kamado for our smoking, and what that does, it allows that smoke ring to penetrate deeper because our meat is colder. Now the perceived smoke ring and the smoke flavour aren't necessarily directly correlated, but it is more for a presentation side to have that nice smoke ring effect. Now that our brisket is on, we won't touch it until probably about the 2 hour mark, and then we'll start spritzing the brisket probably every 45 minutes to 1 hour until we wrap. Now if you're doing this for the first time on a Kamado, you will notice that the temperature does drop a little bit. So as we've opened up the dome, that's cooled a little bit. That will warm up once again. And the fact that we've put a cold meat and also water now in our drip pan will also affect the temperature ever so slightly. So just be sure to keep an eye on your top vent and your bottom vent settings so you reach a stable temperature. Now this is more of a set and forget, unlike say an offset smoker or a kettle if you're smoking on those. However, do keep an eye on your top and bottom vent settings from time to time, just to make sure you're maintaining that ideal cooking temperature. Now we do have a nice clean smoke burning through our Kamado, which is ideal, and that's the kind of sweet smoke that we want to penetrate our meat. So we'll let this cook for 2 hours before we even start opening up our Kamado and checking out our brisket. Now we're just over 1 hour into our cook, and you'll see that our Kamado is holding a really nice and stable cooking temperature of around 120 degrees Celsius or 250 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's one of the incredible things with the Kamado, just how thermally efficient and stable it is. And without a doubt, that's due to its nice thick ceramic construction. Now it is possible on a Kamado to even get within a few degrees of your target temperature. Unlike a kettle or even an offset smoker, which is a lot harder to achieve, on a Kamado it's fairly simple. Another area where a Kamado really shines as well above an offset smoker or even a kettle is its use of fuel. Now because it is so thermally efficient and stable, it doesn't require a lot of fuel, and that fuel can be managed quite effectively. So even with the amount of charcoal that we place into the Kamado, which was roughly 1/3 full, that'll sustain us for well over a 10-hour cook. And the benefit with that is we don't need to keep adding charcoal during that cooking process. Now I've adjusted the top vent so each hole is roughly half covered. And with the bottom vent, I've just reduced that down to roughly 3 to 4 millimeters in opening width. So we're at the 2 hour mark now, and we haven't checked our brisket since then, so let's have a look at our brisket and see how that bark is forming. And we'll also give it a quick spritz for this next hour. And as expected, as we were trimming the brisket, this portion of the brisket has raised itself as well. Now for our spritz, we'll be using 100% apple cider vinegar. And we just want to give it a light coat. Our brisket is looking quite nice, so we'll allow it to cook for another hour and then we'll spritz again. Now we are at the 3 hour mark, so it's time to check the brisket and spritz it. And that is looking and smelling good. We are now at the 4 hour mark, and our Kamado is holding that 120 degrees Celsius, 250 degrees Fahrenheit, nice and stable. So let's check our brisket, and we'll also start measuring the internal temperature. Now different parts of the brisket will measure at a different internal temp. So around the 68-degree mark internal. 69 in some areas. So we're currently in the thermal stall of the brisket, and thermal stall occurs when the meat starts sweating and it starts cooling itself down. So the internal temperature doesn't raise regardless of how long it's been cooking for. Now at this point in time of our cook, we're going to wrap it, and we're going to use butcher's paper as opposed to foil. Foil works really well and traps a lot of moisture in, but it can compromise the bark a little bit. With the butcher's paper, we still get that containment of heat that the foil would also provide. However, because it can also breathe ever so slightly, it doesn't compromise the bark as much. And you'll also observe that most of the moisture on our drip pan has also evaporated. Now, when wrapping our brisket in the butcher's paper, I just like to give it a quick spritz on the paper. And we'll grab a second piece of butcher's paper and wrap it again. Now make sure you put your brisket back the right way up, the same way you took it off. Now that our brisket is wrapped, we're going to continue cooking for around another 3 hours, and then we'll start probing for internal temperature as well as for tenderness. And at this point in time, you can also increase the cooking temperature to around the 125, 130 degrees Celsius mark, so that 260, 275 degree Fahrenheit, without any issues. Now we're at the 7-hour mark, and it is raining ever so slightly, but our Kamado is holding a really nice temperature of that 120 degrees Celsius, 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Now it is time to start probing our brisket and checking that internal temperature as well as its tenderness. Currently at 82 degrees Celsius internal over there, and roughly 82 over here as well. In my experience, a brisket this size using foil would have probably been ready by now. However, using butcher's paper does impact on the cook. So we'll give it 1 more hour and check our brisket again. So we are now at the 8-hour mark, and the rain is still unrelenting. I've bumped up the Kamado temperature to around 275, 285 degrees Fahrenheit. So just shy of 140 degrees Celsius. So let's probe it and see what it's like. So at the 91, 92, 86. So we'll probably give this another half hour to an hour and we'll reprobe it. We are almost at the 9-hour mark, so let's measure the internal temperature of our brisket, but also gauge its tenderness at the same time. 90, just shy of 97 degrees Celsius there, and that is feeling quite tender inside. And just shy of 94 degrees Celsius. Now our brisket is ready to pull off the Kamado, and we'll like to rest it for around 2 hours or until the internal temperature reaches 60 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Now I'm just going to rest the brisket inside our house, which is around 22 degrees Celsius ambient. So our brisket has rested and we've hit an almost ideal internal temperature for serving. So I'll open up the butcher's paper and reveal the brisket, and we'll cut into it and see what it's like. That's one nice juicy looking brisket. You can see there's a lot of juice all around it, which is nice. Not as much as what you would have in a foil arrangement. So let's carve it up. Now I was a little concerned that I probably had wrapped it a bit too early, so we didn't get that quite black finish of the brisket. However, it still looks and smells great. Now that is one nice looking brisket. We have a nice smoke ring formation all around. Just grab that. It's really good. And just pull it apart. And that pulls apart fairly easily as well. It's probably not as moist as I'd like, but it's not too bad. And the fats have rendered down quite nicely. And I'm really pleased with the smoke ring around it. So let's try our brisket and see what it's like. Very nice. Now it's really moist in this upper portion of the brisket. Now it's time to conduct a post-cook review. What are some things that we observed during the cook and post-cook when we cut up the brisket, for example? What was the taste like? What could we have done better? Now let's start off with the brisket itself. Now initially we thought it was going to take around the 7-hour mark. It ended up taking 9 hours to cook on the Kamado. And I believe that has to do more so with the wrap, and that wrap was with butcher paper as opposed to foil. Now in past, when I've used foil, that cook time has greatly reduced. When I have used butcher's paper, I have found that it takes that additional an hour or even 2 hours to cook on the Kamado. And even with yesterday's cook, I think it probably could have done with another half hour to an hour, so all up around a 10-hour cook on the Kamado. What I also did observe is that rest period using butcher paper wrap didn't take as long, so we reached that 140 Fahrenheit or around 60 Celsius internal temp of the brisket a lot sooner. So what usually would have taken maybe 2 hours of rest or more in foil took around 1 hour in butcher's paper wrap. Now that also could be due to the brisket itself. Now every brisket is different and the cook will vary slightly for each different type of brisket, and that may have to do with the fat content, the type of beef and so on. Now something else I also observed was we probably wrapped a little bit too early at the 4-hour mark. We probably could have left it for another hour and just get that brisket looking nice and black, kind of like that meteor black colour, and that would have given us a nicer coloured bark. However, in saying that, our bark turned out quite well, and we did also get a nice smoke ring. Now a good smoke ring doesn't necessarily correlate to a good smoke flavour in the brisket. And all up, we had quite a mild smoke flavour through the brisket. Now one of the key takeaways in this cook is that you don't cook to a time, and internal temp is a very good gauge. However, you should cook to a tenderness when it comes to brisket. And obviously you don't want to make it too tender where it crumbles under its own weight, but you also don't want the other extreme where it's too tough to eat. So finding that balance is key with briskets. Now let's open up the Kamado and have a look at the charcoal or ash that's been left over from this cook. Now I did give the grill and the water drip pan a quick clean prior to this video. Now you'll observe that we still have quite a fair bit of charcoal left over, and that was after a 9-hour cook also. So you can see all this charcoal here, we can still use that for another cook. So let's have a quick look and see what's hidden underneath and left over. Now all our smoking timber, that oak that we had placed down, those 2 pieces, that's all been consumed, which is good. And we've still got a fair bit of charcoal left over, and it just testifies to the Kamado's thermal efficiency as well. Now let's have a look at our ashtray and see if those additional smoking chips have been left over as well. And as you can see, we still have our oak and also our smaller smoking chips that have remained in the ashtray. So what this tells me is that not much of the smoking chips were consumed during that cook, and maybe it wasn't even worth putting those smoking chips in the ashtray in the first place. So I've just emptied the ash and you can see the remaining smoking chips that have been left in the ashtray. I really hope you found this video informative. Don't forget to like it, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and hit that bell notification icon. Thanks for watching.